Hi, it's lovely to be here today with Amrita Sohal from Nottingham University, where we have great pleasure in talking to today. Amrita was the recipient of the 2021 CPCAB BACP Research Award. The title, A Therapy for the Worried Well, a longitudinal analysis of the effectiveness of person-centered therapy within a sample of suicidal clients. And I'm looking forward to exploring that a bit further today with Amrita. Maybe you'd like to just introduce yourself, Amrita, and why you chose this particular subject to explore.
Yes, so I am a student from University of Nottingham. I did my master's there, and currently I'm working as a therapist for young homeless people for a voluntary organisation. And yes, this topic and this research project was something that I knew I kind of wanted to study around that area as I entered into my second year of my master's, and we started to think about what we would be researching. As you'll know, within recent years there have been lots of growing apprehensions around the increasing rates of suicide. The Office for National Statistics actually reported that at the end of 2019, I think the rates of suicide hit a 19-year high. So they were higher than ever at that point. And following that realization, there's been a surge in demand for identifying and increasing access to therapies that are effective for supporting individuals experiencing suicidal ideation. And although there'd been lots of research that was based around the efficacy of person-centered therapy, there was no research out there that had actually studied how effective, or if person-centered therapy was effective within this population itself. And a particularly vulnerable population. And given the importance of evidence-based practice in the current world, person-centered counselling has got to be tested within suicidal clients before it can be deemed as clinically effective. So I kind of noticed a gap and thought, that feels like a really important gap to address. But alongside that, being a person-centered therapist in training, I felt very curious about the topic because to me, the dialogue seemed to be centered around person-centered therapy being solely appropriate for the worried well, which can be considered those experiencing mild to moderate psychological distress. And there was quite a large dialogue around person-centered counselling being inappropriate, if not harmful, for those in crisis. And naturally, I felt, curious to find out whether this mode of therapy and the philosophy that I believe in, is it limited to, or am I limited to supporting and facilitating growth within clients only experiencing mild psychological distress, or also those experiencing quite severe psychological distress? And, in all honesty, I also experienced and have gone through my own very low times, and I had my own encounters with suicidal ideation in the past, and I received person-centered counselling during those times. And for me, that mode of support was extremely powerful. So, for me, it was like, surely this can't be the case. Surely person-centered counselling is helpful and can facilitate growth and is beneficial if you feel as though you want to end your own life. So, yeah, all in all, it was wanting to address the gap within the research, as well as my own personal curiosity through personal experiences and as a trainee therapist.
So there's something there, I guess, about coming from a personal experience and the usefulness, I guess, of person-centered therapy for you in those low moments. But also, I guess, filling that gap. And I suppose person-centered therapists are quite bad of actually being able to provide the evidence and the research that the therapy works, and it's looking at that gap and sort of saying, okay, does this work? Or my felt sense is it work, but I need to somehow prove it. Is that sort of what you're saying?
Yeah, that was my felt sense, and that's what I believed, that it is beneficial. But I can't just say that and hope people will take it as fact. There's got to be evidence to show that. And also, there's not that great of an access at the moment to person-centered counselling in mainstream healthcare. So if there is anything that I, would like to do, and that is to kind of fight to prove that, we can help people with this mode of therapy. And in order for that to be believed and it's got to be proven empirically. So, having that opportunity to research on my master's felt like, this is my chance to test this. And if we find what I think we will find, then, we can prove that empirically and yeah.
So I guess we're always looking at the end result, but we need to look at the middle bit, I guess, first. But it feels like there's something there that if the results are positive, and I believe they were from your research, about then where you take that so that we can actually get this recognised as effective for suicidal clients or clients experiencing deep trauma in some ways.
Yeah, definitely.
So I'm curious as to maybe what method you use and where you drew your clients from.
Yeah, so we conducted a quantitative study. So it was based on numerical data. It was longitudinal. So we basically had a clinical sample from a community interest company, the HFP, who provide free person-centered counselling to the adult community of Nottingham. And the study was longitudinal, so we drew data from their database because they're a clinic that is committed to conducting research, and clients do enter the clinic on referral and they provide consent to conduct. Well, not to conduct, but to answer and to take part in measures and questionnaires throughout the course of therapy. So data, they have a database there, and we drew data from that database. The clinic itself is run by graduate and trainee person-centered therapists, and they provide counselling from ranging from 20 sessions to 40 sessions for clients, and each therapist that provides counselling in that clinic has passed a readiness practice panel where they're assessed against the PCAB scale, so the person-centered experiential psychotherapy scale, and as long as they have a sufficient score, they are able to then provide therapy in that counselling in that clinic. And each therapist also attends fortnightly supervision with a person-centered therapist. And we essentially drew data from session 1, 5, 10, 15 and 20 over the course of therapy. And the data that was drawn was data measuring their levels of authenticity, well-being and psychological distress. So what we did was we tested whether suicidal clients, so they were clients that considered themselves as suicidal when they entered the clinic and when they referred themselves. We tested whether they experienced improvements in authenticity, well-being and psychological distress over the course of 20 sessions of therapy.
So that sounds like almost quite a large client base or number of clients to draw from. I'm just wondering if you can explain a little bit more about what longitudinal analysis is for the viewer.
Yeah, so longitudinal analysis is where you study a sample or you conduct the study over the course of time, over the course of a long period of time. So for us, it was over the course of 20 sessions. That's what essentially makes it longitudinal, and it's also would be considered a naturalistic study because it was conducted with clients receiving person-centered therapy, a clinical sample, and it was non-experimental because we weren't manipulating anything or seeking to control anything. We merely drew data from their self-reported data. The measures that were used also, just to give you a bit of information about that. So the measures used for studying the level of authenticity was the authenticity scale by Wood et al. And then well-being was measured by the scale of general well-being. And psychological distress was measured by client personal questionnaires, where they essentially listed things that they felt distressed by and different parts and aspects of their distress. And they would then score them on a weekly or a regular basis throughout therapy.
So the aim at the end of, let's say, 20 sessions was to see, or to map, or it has mapped where they were at the start to where they were in terms of their well-being by the end of therapy. And that's the data that's been used for this study.
Yes, so where they were in terms of authenticity, well-being, and psychological distress. So did they improve in authenticity and well-being, and did they feel reductions in psychological distress over the course of, yeah.
And I'm wondering how many clients you were able to draw upon for the study.
So we, after doing the data cleaning and, pulling out the clients that had actually considered themselves at risk of suicide, we had a sample of 56 clients.
Oh, wow, that's a large sample, isn't it? That's a very generous sample.
Yeah, which was great to work with. I think, one of the things I would say potentially to work on in the future for, potentially to develop going forward would be actually just to increase that sample size as well, to like a minimum of 100, for example. But 56 in itself did have, great statistical power as well. It didn't necessarily reduce the reliability of the study, but it's always better if you can get as much participants as possible.
And was there a balance between gender and age, ethnicity, that sort of thing, or?
There was an imbalance. In fact, yes, there was. It was slightly more skewed to. So most participants had identified themselves as female, and it was on a ratio of roughly 3 to 1. So we had roughly, I think, about 40. It was a 3 to 1 male to female, and there was one participant that considered themselves as other. So gender-wise, it was skewed. Ethnicity-wise, it was quite mixed, and we had quite a large group of different ethnicities in the mix. But gender was, one of the, I think, limitations when we look at the skew. Yeah.
And I'm wondering, I'm just sort of curious, is that because you feel that, or is it because maybe male clients are underrepresented at the clinic?
It was to be fair, in the clinic as a whole, that there are a lot of male clients, but within when we actually put the filter in terms of, drawing out the clients that consider themselves at risk of suicide, that was where the drop in male clients in that sample, that's where the drop was.
And did that inform in any way perhaps the suicidal ideation is more prevalent among female or male versus male clients, or was that sort of not really looked at? Or
it wasn't necessarily looked at, but just thinking about it, looking back in hindsight, I guess it would be worth looking deeper into that, because as we can see from statistics and from what is reported, male suicidal ideation and male suicide rates are on the increase. So I wouldn't say that it necessarily helps us draw the conclusion that perhaps females tend to feel more suicidal than male clients. But perhaps it's the case of, in that clinic particularly, are there as many male clients as female clients that consider themselves at risk of suicide? Was it just a case of the sample we had there?
And I'm wondering, sort of think that sounds quite meaty in some ways, that you've got both male and female clients, but you've also got a range of ethnicities and cultural backgrounds accessing the service and being part of the sample. I'm wondering what the findings were for you.
We had a lot of findings, and we kind of looked at the study in two halves. Because as well as studying the levels of authenticity and well-being and psychological distress over the course of therapy, we also looked at whether authenticity and well-being could predict levels of psychological distress towards the end of therapy. So if I start with telling you a little bit about the levels of authenticity and well-being and psychological distress, and then I'll move on to the predictive nature of authenticity and well-being. So when it came to assessing authenticity, well-being and psychological distress, we actually found that there were significant increases in authenticity and well-being over the course of therapy, and significant reductions in psychological distress. But what was really interesting was that our results suggested that there was a minimum of 15 sessions required for significant improvements to take place. So there was at least 5 sessions needed to take place for any changes to be seen, but 15 sessions for those changes to be of particular significance and of statistical significance. So that does widen our prior knowledge, because we are now able to see that within the context of person-centered therapy, suicidal clients are also facilitated to move towards congruence and greater levels of well-being and psychological adjustment and less distress. And it does also, reject the claims that person-centered therapy isn't effective for supporting clients experiencing suicidal ideation. So yeah, those were the findings on that part of the study. And then
so let's just hold that one for a moment. Yeah. So what feels important to me there, and maybe this might be my interpretation, so correct me if I'm wrong, that it almost takes those first 5 sessions in order to, I guess, establish the relationship for the client to trust, for the client to start to open up and be authentic, but it then takes up to 15. So overall, it takes 15 sessions to somehow solidify and support some form of change. Is that what I'm hearing?
Yeah. So, it can be attributed to that sense of establishing the relationship. And, as Rogers did theorize that when clients enter therapy, they enter with little or no self-awareness, a degree of defensiveness and little positive self-regard and conditions of worth, as well as experiences that might be denied or distorted to their awareness. But then as the client gradually begins to perceive the therapist's empathy and unconditional positive regard of them and begins to build that sense of safety and trust, they gradually develop unconditional positive self-regard and greater authenticity and congruence. There is like a loosening of construct, a breakdown of the conditions of worth, and more of a free flow and expression of their organismic experiencing and their inner thoughts and feelings.
So over the course of sessions, they've gone from being quite closed to being actually able to open up, become more authentic and transparent within themselves, and share that and start to have this dialogue almost with themselves as to what's really going on.
Yes, yeah, and just opening up to their own true experiencing and discovering that. Yeah.
And I'm just wondering, and I hope I'm not getting ahead of myself, when you say it takes about, on average, shall we say 15 sessions for some form of effective change, I'm wondering how that compares to other theoretical modalities. Is that sort of the ballpark type of number of sessions, maybe for CBD or psychodynamic, or are they quicker, take longer, or?
It's probably something that, we do need to look into, and it would be really interesting to compare and see, are there any differences across the different modalities? Is it roughly the same, or does it take longer, less? Why might that be? is definitely something that is worth further investigation. Be really interesting.
There's some more work for you, and I guess in the long time, how sustainable is the change? Does it last, or is it sort of or does it only last a short time? What's the effectiveness long term after therapy?
Yeah.
I'm sorry, I've moved us away, haven't I, from your findings?
No, that's fine. It's really interesting to think about. But in terms of the other findings of the project as well, we looked at the relationships, like I said, about does authenticity and well-being predict perhaps later levels of distress. So in order to do that, what we had to do was find if they were correlated, if they were associated. And if they were associated in any way, then we could test whether they predicted, whether authenticity and well-being predicted distress. So what we did find was that their authenticity and well-being were negatively correlated with psychological distress. So we could find through our predictive analyses that authenticity and well-being did predict later levels of distress. So what it indicates is that the more congruent, the more authentic you are, and the greater levels of well-being that you possess, the less distressed you are likely to be at later stages of therapy, because perhaps you've been able to better engage well with the exploration of your experiences, with your thoughts, with your feelings, and essentially really engage well with therapy. So that kind of relates very well to Roger's theory around authenticity and psychological distress, because he suggested that the more authentic and the closer you are to becoming a fully functioning person, and the less psychological tension you experience, the more effective you are in problem solving, the more open you are to your inner experiencing, the better you are able to accurately symbolize your needs within your awareness. So it makes sense that authenticity and well-being could predict the later stages of lower levels of distress at the end of therapy.
Again, let me see if I can contextualize that in some way and understand that. So in some ways, what I guess what I'm hearing is, depending on the client's authenticity and well-being, you can predict somehow where they are likely to be at any point in the therapy, or I'm guessing how long the therapy might take, or whether this therapy is suitable for that client.
I think it could be best understood as, if a client is particularly authentic and has great levels of well-being and psychological adjustment, then they are likely to gain a lot out of therapy, because they have that level of openness with themselves, less defensiveness, and they're open to their kind of inner experiencing. So if you're more authentic, you can get a lot out of therapy, is essentially what that pattern and what the data showed.
But I'm guessing that could depend on where they are in therapy. I'm sort of guessing, certainly from some clients I've worked with, that at the start of therapy, it might take them a long time to get to that place where they can be authentic.
Yes, and it could, yeah.
So I'm guessing from the predictive point of view, what I'm trying to understand is it that you get to a point where you then know, oh, this client is going to be okay. They're gonna get to the end of therapy and it's going to be effective, or they're still stuck in that, they're stuck in being authentic, so predictively they're not going to move forward quite as quickly at this point in time.
Yeah, I think it's less that we can predict they will be at a certain stage by the end of therapy, but more so we're beginning to see that perhaps someone's level of authenticity and well-being can help what someone may gain from therapy. But that's not to say that if somebody has lower levels of authenticity and well-being, that they won't gain anything from therapy or of that sort. And that sort of statement can only be made after, I guess, comparing you know, what somebody who is considered authentic at the beginning of therapy, what their journey or what their data may look like in comparison to somebody who has lower levels of authenticity at the start of therapy. I personally don't feel like it means they won't gain anything or of that sort, but I think it's more to say that greater levels of authenticity just show that you have maybe more chance of getting there sooner. You know, again, requires more investigation.
So I was linking that to, was it 56 participants in the sample? Were you able to see a pattern that at the end of their sessions, all 56 clients had somehow increased their well-being and authenticity to a greater or lesser level? If that makes sense. Sorry, that's...
Yeah, they had it had increased to a greater level, well-being and authenticity, and then distress had decreased significantly as well.
And that's because of their well-being and authenticity?
No, it wasn't a cause of that. It was more a trend. That was the trend, but we haven't been able to establish whether that was the cause because those weren't the analyses that we conducted. Yeah,
that's interesting. It sort of leads us into the limitations of the research, and I think we're already finding several threads that are coming out.
Yes.
Which would maybe more work for you to pioneer and champion. So I'm wondering, you know, in a nutshell, what do you think the limitations of the research was, and where you might want to take it to solidify, I guess, what you've already done?
Yeah, so I think as it's such a, you know, it's the first study that's been conducted of this sort that has tried to address that gap. There are so many questions and so many potential threads, like you say, that could be continued from this. So, well, one of the limitations that I personally identified, as it was a longitudinal study, was the attrition. So we did have a loss of some participants over the course of the research process, not most, but some. So there was a small rate of dropout, and those reasons weren't known. We're not entirely sure what those reasons were. They can vary from things like physical illness, relocation, just practical barriers to attending, maybe overwhelm, or even, you know, sudden things like potentially even death. But it would be really useful going forward to conduct the longitudinal study in a way where perhaps we make follow-up contact with clients so we know what the reasons of dropout were. It may tell us so much more. And like we just mentioned as well, can we consider authenticity and well-being as a cause of the findings? Is it a cause? Because that's not a test we had carried out. So going forward, that would be really interesting as well. You know, can that be considered an actual cause of it? Other things as well, like the sample size. I think although it was a good sample size, it would be better if it was more balanced, less skewed towards one particular gender, and instead a little bit more balanced. It makes it more generalizable to the wider population. So it would be great to replicate things with a larger sample size. We did consider modifying the sample size, but it would have reduced. So if we'd made it more balanced, it would have reduced the sample size significantly, and we wouldn't have had as much power or reliability in the study. So sample size would be one thing going forward.
And I'm sort of wondering with the sample size, you said you were basing the clinic in Nottingham, whether the study is more focused on maybe whatever's going on in Nottingham and how that might look if it was looked at from a national perspective.
Yes, definitely combining data from many areas of the nation would really solidify and really solidify those results, and it really be interesting to see what the findings are there. Yeah, that's a really, really good point. And also just comparing clients receiving person-centered therapy with no therapy. You know, are there any differences there? Are there any differences between suicidal clients and non-suicidal clients when it comes to changes in authenticity, well-being, psychological distress, when it comes to looking at can authenticity and well-being predict those levels of distress? You know, does that change between clients that aren't suicidal or are suicidal as well? That would be really interesting to see as well.
Well, that, if I heard that right, that was quite an interesting point between clients who, or people that seek therapy and those that don't seek therapy. That might be quite interesting to see how that could even be conducted.
Yeah, it would be something we would need a lot of thought, but when it comes to quantitative research, it's often quite important to compare it to a control group where there is no therapy taking place, just so we can see that this change that is being seen and this trend that is being seen, is it because of therapy or is it a natural change? You know, although we would have our predictions around that, you need that evidence to show that there is a difference between somebody who isn't seeking person-centered therapy and is seeking it.
And I suppose with that, I suppose there's all sorts of ways to well-being, which is not just about therapy. So I guess it depends also on what other support maybe a client or a person is receiving and how that might impact on their well-being.
Yeah, and medication perhaps as well. You know, other modes of support, perhaps medication, things like that, they need to also be controlled for.
Absolutely. So it sounds like it's opening up a lot of questions, but also, I think this is really important, it is demonstrating the effectiveness of person-centered therapy to work with these more complex issues, such as suicidal clients.
Yeah, and that's the kind of thing, that's the major message and finding we've taken away from this research, is that person-centered therapy is effective, although it may not get as much credit for it. It is effective in supporting this vulnerable sample of people.
And I think we started to explore this slightly earlier, that it is as effective as other types of therapy.
Well, previous research has found that it is as effective within the general population, but it hadn't been tested within suicidal clients. So I think the next step would be to now look at, does that comparison and the level of equivalence we have found previously, does that exist also within suicidal clients? Yeah.
Is there anything else that has come out of the research that feels important to you?
I think, we've mainly addressed a lot of it, but I think just sort of that message that it does reject the acclamations that person-centered therapy is damaging in some sort of way, or inappropriate or unhelpful, and we've been able to really address that. So I think that's one of the most poignant things that's kind of emerged for me from the research.
So I'm guessing what perhaps you're also saying is, as person-centered therapists, we need to champion our own approach and do the research to show its effectiveness.
In order to be maintained as our own distinct approach, we must carry out the research to prove that our approach holds value. We can openly say often the person-centered approach isn't considered or is perhaps undermined for severe psychological distress. So we need the research to help show and prove that we have something valuable to offer to clients. And when we do that, we have more chance of clients getting access to our mode of support, because in the IAPT at the moment, I think it's just 6 to 12 sessions of counselling you can receive for mild to moderate depression. and that's about as far as it goes. But if we can prove that we can help we can help lots of groups of clients, and like this study has shown, we require at least 15 sessions to see changes of significance. Results like that, research like that, helps prove that things maybe need to change and access needs to increase to person-centered therapy.
And I think it's also looking at what is the long-term benefit of the therapy. Yeah. Is it sustained? And I think we spend a lot of time looking at, what is the end result at the end of therapy, but then what happens next? Do we actually monitor that in some way, or get any feedback on that?
Yeah.
And I suppose, I think we've covered this, but I think it's always useful just to maybe state why we think research is important.
It's so important. I think it enhances, first of all, our awareness around therapy, clients, therapeutic processes, which help us develop our practices, as practitioners, that first of all. But I think also it just opens up that dialogue and helps us think about things from different angles, have those discussions like we are having today, and which are really important. And it also helps us prove that counselling and therapy is changing lives, and show that this work is so valuable, and to then show that helps increase access to that level of support.
And I think also, and certainly I'm always mindful of students, is, when you read a piece of research or an article, you don't have to take it as gospel. It is also opening up other questions as well. And, if you do disagree with something, well, maybe you need to do some research as well, and engage why you think that wasn't quite right, or where something hasn't quite worked. And to look at things like sample size. Was it like a very generous sample size like you have, or was it only 2 or 3 people that they've looked at? It's question things, and it's okay to question and find out where the truth might lie at the end of the day.
Exactly, and I think that's what the research is. What our aim is, we're trying to get to the truth, and in order to do that, we must question things from as many angles as possible, so we can get to that. And to get to the truth, you've got to ask these questions, you've got to test them. So yeah, I think research is so important, and it can be daunting. I'm fully aware of that as well. It can feel daunting. It can feel daunting to students. But I think when you look at the importance of it and the kind of thing, the benefits you gain from it, it's completely worth it. And sometimes you may feel scary at the beginning. Once you get going, you'll have support around you as well. So yeah, it's really important.
So I'm wondering, as we're coming to the end of our time, where you might be going from here in terms of this research, or have you got bigger plans? Or
so I am kind of in the process of getting this published, bringing that together, so that all of these questions that have arose from this very early research, we have that out there, so people can pull it apart and they can think, right, okay, we need to test this and this, and we can get a much deeper understanding about the trends we found, the patterns we found, and yeah, hopefully the research will drive that. So that's the next step.
Well, I wish you every luck with that, Amrita. And it's been an absolute pleasure talking with you today. And thank you for sharing your time with us.
Thank you for your time as well. And yeah, it's been lovely having a conversation with you today.
Thank you.